Birmingham, England. 1965. The city was an industrial landscape where post-war devastation remained visible years after World War II. In the Aston district, rows of terraced houses sat beside small factories. The sound of hammers and machinery formed the soundtrack to daily life. 4 young men grew up within walking distance of each other on these grim streets. John Michael Osborne, Ozzy to everyone who knew him, lived at 14 Lodge Road. He grew up in one of Birmingham's roughest areas, where bomb sites from the war had become children's playgrounds. Tony Iommi lived on Park Lane. Terence Geezer Butler resided on nearby Victoria Road. Bill Ward grew up just beyond Villa Park Stadium. For working-class Birmingham youth in the 1960s, the future meant one thing: factory work. 45 years on an assembly line. That was the destiny awaiting anyone who didn't excel at school. But these 4 had another dream: music. Tony Iommi learned accordion first, then switched to guitar. He joined local bands, the Rockin' Chevrolets, the Birds and Bees. By 1968, he'd been offered a spot touring Europe. Finally, an escape from Birmingham, an escape from the factories. On his last day at the sheet metal factory where he worked as a welder, Iommi went home for lunch. He considered not going back. His mother scolded him. Finish the job properly. When he returned, the worker who normally operated the guillotine press hadn't shown up. They told Iommi to work the machine himself. As he pushed metal through the press, the machine came down on his hand. In pulling back quickly, he pulled the tips of his middle and ring fingers off. He was 17 years old, right-handed, but he played guitar left-handed. Those were his fretting fingers. At the hospital, doctors told him his guitar playing days were over. Tony Iommi fell into depression. His dream, his only escape, seemed finished. Then his former factory manager visited, bringing a Django Reinhardt record. Reinhardt had become a legendary jazz guitarist despite losing the use of 2 fingers in a fire. Iommi decided he wouldn't accept defeat. He melted down a plastic washing-up bottle, shaped it with a hot soldering iron, and created homemade thimbles to extend his damaged fingers. He cut sections from a leather jacket to cover them, but playing remained difficult. The thimbles prevented him from feeling the strings. He couldn't bend them properly. Fast playing became nearly impossible. So Iommi adapted. He sought lighter gauge strings. When manufacturers didn't make them, he used banjo strings instead. He focused on chord shapes rather than single-note solos. He pressed down harder on the strings to compensate for lost feeling. And slowly a new sound began to emerge. Heavier, darker, more aggressive. Iommi later reflected that trying to make the sound bigger helped fill in for the chords he could no longer play. An industrial accident was about to change the sound of rock music forever. By 1968, Iommi had joined a band called Mythology with drummer Bill Ward. They explored loud, blues-heavy music together. After Mythology dissolved, Ward and Iommi recruited Ozzy Osbourne and Geezer Butler. They called themselves Earth. Influenced by British blues bands like Led Zeppelin, Cream, and John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, they played psychedelic blues rock, but they weren't standing out. Then Geezer Butler had an experience that changed everything. Butler, a fan of horror films and Dennis Wheatley's black magic novels, briefly flirted with the occult. One night he saw what he believed was a figure from the dark side at the foot of his bed. Terrified, he abandoned his dabbling immediately. But the experience gave him an idea for a song. The band noticed something in Birmingham. Massive queues formed outside cinemas showing horror films. People wanted to be scared. It offered escapism from the dull realities of working life. If people paid to be frightened at the movies, why not give them frightening music? Across the street from their rehearsal space stood a cinema showing a Boris Karloff horror film, Black Sabbath. The band changed their name. They wrote a song called Black Sabbath, opening with rain, thunder, and church bells. then exploding into a heavy, ominous riff. Ozzy's vocals ranged from dark murmurs to screaming bursts. No one had heard anything like it. Birmingham's Henry's Blues House became their testing ground. Manager Jim Simpson booked blues players there, attracting musicians like Robert Plant and John Bonham. Black Sabbath, still called Earth, kept pestering Simpson for gigs. Finally, he gave them a slot. The response was immediate. Earth quickly transformed from a small regular act into the main attraction, drawing crowds exceeding the venue's 160-person capacity. Their first gig as Black Sabbath came on August 30th, 1969. By October, they'd finished recording their self-titled debut album, tracked in essentially one day. Released on Friday, February 13th, 1970, Black Sabbath shocked listeners. The album cover showed a mysterious woman in black standing before a watermill. It reached number 8 on the UK albums chart and number 23 in America. Critics hated it. Lester Bangs dismissed them in Rolling Stone. Radio stations were frightened by the dark sound and imagery. But underground, something was building. Young people, outcasts, misfits, those bummed out by the fading idealism of the 1960s, found something in Black Sabbath's music that spoke to them. The band arrived at the height of the Vietnam War, on the other side of the hippie era. There was a mood of doom and aggression. Their record label, Vertigo, saw the album's unexpected success and made a decision: get them back in the studio immediately. 4 months after releasing their debut, Black Sabbath was told to record another album. The problem? They didn't have enough material. Spring 1970. Black Sabbath was touring constantly. UK clubs, European venues, anywhere that would book them. Most of the songs for Paranoid evolved during onstage improvisational jams. In Switzerland, they played the Beat Club in Zurich's Hotel Hirschen. The engagement included 7 45-minute sets per day for 6 weeks. Black Sabbath didn't have much material, so they played 1 song per set for 45 minutes, using the club for rehearsals. During extended jams, Tony Iommi would find a riff. The band would lock into it, exploring where it could go. Ozzy worked on melodies. Geezer provided the rumbling bass foundation and started thinking about lyrics. War Pigs emerged this way. During the song Warning, they used to jam extensively, and one night Tony just started playing a new riff. Originally, the song was called Walpurgis, a term for a pagan celebration that Geezer described as like Christmas for Satanists. The lyrics were different, more explicitly occult-themed, but Geezer Butler was deeply affected by the Vietnam War. Britain stood on the verge of being drawn into the conflict. Protests filled the streets. Butler rewrote the lyrics, transforming Walpurgis into a scathing anti-war statement. The new War Pigs targeted politicians and generals, comparing them to witches at black masses, describing them as Satan's servants sending working-class kids to die in wars they'd never fight themselves. Butler later clarified that to him, war itself was Satan. The song wasn't about the devil, it was about the evil of those who wage war. Other songs took shape. Iron Man began with a heavy, plodding riff. Originally called Iron Bloke, the title came when Ozzy commented that the intro sounded like a big iron person walking. Hand of Doom addressed drug addiction among Vietnam veterans. Electric Funeral imagined nuclear apocalypse. By the time their spring tour ended, Black Sabbath had rough versions of several songs. But when they regrouped to prepare for recording, they realized something. They still didn't have enough material for a full album. June 1970. Producer Roger Bain brought Black Sabbath to Rockfield Studios in South Wales for pre-production. They refined their material, tightened arrangements. Then, between June 16th and 21, they recorded the entire album at Regent Sound Studios and Island Studios in London. 6 days total. The band wrote songs and created riffs while touring. When the tour ended, they returned to the studio and recorded as if performing live. Compared to the single day they'd had for their first album, 6 days seemed like luxury. They'd played many songs on the road, so they acted on instinct. War Pigs opened the album, 7.5 minutes of apocalyptic heaviness. The riff shifted tempos, building tension. Ozzy's vocals conveyed genuine anger and disgust at warmongering politicians. Paranoid wasn't even supposed to exist. Drummer Bill Ward explained that they didn't have enough songs for the album. Tony Iommi just played a guitar lick, and that was it. The song took 20 to 25 minutes from start to finish. Geezer Butler wrote the lyrics in 5 minutes, sitting down and writing as quickly as possible. The result was a 2.5-minute burst of manic energy, faster than anything they'd recorded before. The lyrics captured feelings of alienation and depression, Ozzy singing about thinking he'd lose his mind. The song crystallized the band's writing process. Iommi initiating ideas with his charred riffs, Ozzy working on melody, Geezer providing drive and lyrics, Bill Ward locking into pounding rhythms beneath Butler's bass rumble. Iron Man featured one of the most iconic riffs in rock history. The song told a science fiction story. A man travels to the future, witnesses apocalypse, and upon returning becomes trapped in an iron body. Mocked and shunned, he takes revenge by causing the very apocalypse he'd witnessed. Planet Caravan provided an interlude. Ozzy sang through a Leslie speaker with producer Roger Bain, using an oscillator to create an otherworldly effect. Electric Funeral depicted nuclear holocaust. Hand of Doom chronicled a soldier's descent into heroin addiction. Rat Salad showcased Bill Ward's jazz-influenced drumming. Fairies Wear Boots closed the album with a story inspired by a confrontation with skinheads wearing Dr. Martens boots. Geezer Butler later said the entire album felt completely natural and organic. Songs came together immediately with such fire. Each time they went into rehearsal, they emerged with a completed song. The chemistry between the 4 musicians was undeniable. But even as they finished recording, nobody knew what to call the album. The band wanted to name the album War Pigs, after the opening track. Cover art had already been commissioned. The album sleeve featured a man in a pink leotard with a shield and sword, representing the war pig. But after the record company heard the song Paranoid, they believed it had potential as a single and changed the album's title at the very last minute. Some accounts suggest the title would have changed anyway. Calling the record War Pigs risked unwanted controversy in America at the height of Vietnam War protests. The cover art remained unchanged. Butler lamented that the cover was bad enough when it was going to be called War Pigs, but when it became Paranoid, it didn't even make sense. What did a warrior with a sword have to do with paranoia? The image was designed and photographed by Keith McMillan in a London studio using intentional blur to emphasize motion. His assistant Roger Brown served as the model, striking a dynamic pose suggesting frantic pursuit or evasion. The entire shoot cost around $600, minimal compared to elaborate progressive rock covers being produced at the time. But that low-budget, slightly confusing aesthetic became iconic. The single Paranoid was released in August 1970, backed with The Wizard. It reached number 4 on the UK charts, becoming Black Sabbath's only top 10 hit. Suddenly, screaming kids showed up at their gigs. People danced. The band worried they were becoming too commercial, too pop. Tony Iommi recalled that the single attracted screaming kids. They saw people dancing and decided not to do singles for a long while to stay true to fans who'd liked them before they became popular. The full album Paranoid was released in the UK on September 18, 1970, the same day Jimi Hendrix died. Within days, it shot to number 1 on the UK albums chart. Paranoid's US release was delayed until January 1971 because their debut album was still on the charts. When it finally came out in America, something remarkable happened. The album reached number 12 on the US Billboard 200 with virtually no radio airplay. How? Word of mouth. Underground networks. Kids discovering something that spoke to their darkness, their outsider status, their anger at a world that seemed broken. Joe Smith, who signed the group to Warner Brothers, noted that what astounded them were the sales. Black Sabbath became their most efficient seller. While mainstream critics dismissed them and radio programmers refused to play them, Black Sabbath built a loyal fan base through constant touring. The album's chart success allowed them to tour the US for the first time in October 1970. They became an indefatigable road band, playing early 1970s rock festivals and building their reputation as a formidable live act. Their dark aesthetic frightened many. The band saw themselves as the opposite of California's flower power hippie movement. They grew up in a gritty city at a time when there was genuine fear of being enlisted for Vietnam. Accusations of Satanism followed them everywhere. In Britain, a nurse was found dead with the Paranoid album on her turntable. The album's possible influence was mentioned at the inquest, though it was ultimately decided Black Sabbath weren't to blame. Tony Iommi wrote in his memoir that it was shocking to hear about this because it wasn't what they were about. They weren't trying to kill people. The band wore crosses, not as satanic symbols, but to ward off evil. Their lyrics, primarily written by Geezer Butler, explored themes of war, social chaos, the supernatural, and the conflict between good and evil. Butler later expressed frustration at how fans misinterpreted their lyrics, noting that songs like Hand of Doom were anti-drug, not pro-drug. But the controversy only added to their mystique. By the end of 1970, Black Sabbath had established themselves as something entirely new in rock music. They had created heavy metal. What made Paranoid so revolutionary? Start with Tony Iommi's guitar sound. His factory accident led him to tune down his guitar, lowering string tension to ease pain on his fingertips. Bassist Geezer Butler tuned down to match him. Sabbath was among the first bands to utilize lower tunings, and the technique became a mainstay of heavy metal. Iommi combined blues-like guitar solos and dark minor key riffing with revolutionary high gain, heavily distorted tone using power chords, a modified treble boosting effect pedal, and a Gibson SG. The result was crushing heaviness, riffs that felt physical, almost violent. Henry Rollins, the Black Flag frontman turned music commentator, noted that there's not a lot of music on the Paranoid album, but there's a lot of space, and that's where it gets its power. Bill Ward's drumming combined jazz influences with rock power, providing dynamic punch. Geezer Butler's bass didn't just follow the guitar. It created a rumbling foundation, sometimes leading the charge. Ozzy Osbourne's vocals were unlike anything in rock. His style was urgent, real, and honest. Everything he experienced and wanted to escape came out in his singing with his incredible, unique voice. The lyrics set Black Sabbath apart from their contemporaries. While other bands sang about love and peace, Black Sabbath addressed darker realities. War Pigs rebuked politicians and war. Hand of Doom explored the horrors of Vietnam and soldiers coming home addicted to opium. Electric Funeral imagined nuclear apocalypse. It was the first time listeners heard themes like PTSD and radiation addressed in rock music. The album raised questions about an impossibly complicated world. Songs like Hand of Doom told stories of Vietnam veterans, the working class that politicians mobilized in War Pigs, returning home disgusted and disillusioned, turning to drugs. These were working class kids from Birmingham singing about working class realities: war, poverty, alienation, environmental destruction. The album delivered bleak but unforgettable songs about war, corruption, and trauma. It was brutally honest in ways rock music hadn't been before. When Paranoid was released, critics savaged it. Music journalist Lester Bangs described them as unskilled laborers. Mainstream reviewers couldn't understand why anyone would want to listen to such dark, heavy music. But fans knew better. Within 7 months of their debut, Black Sabbath's sound had progressed tremendously. The fledgling genre they were pioneering was taking flight. Over the following decades, critical opinion shifted dramatically. In 2017, Rolling Stone ranked Paranoid #1 on their list of the 100 greatest metal albums of all time. It currently sits at number 139 on Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time. According to Rolling Stone's Joe Levy, Sabbath ruled for bummed-out kids in the 70s, and nearly every heavy metal and extreme rock band of the last 3 decades, including Metallica, Nirvana, and Slipknot, owes a debt to Iommi's crushing guitar riffs, Ward and Butler's rhythm section, and Osbourne's vocals. The influence spread across genres. Thrash metal bands like Metallica and Slayer built on Sabbath's heaviness and speed. Doom metal bands took the slow, sludgy riffs to their logical conclusion. Grunge bands like Soundgarden and Alice in Chains borrowed the darkness and heavy tones. Even bands outside metal felt the impact. The raw power, the willingness to embrace darkness, the rejection of mainstream expectations. These became touchstones for punk, alternative rock, and beyond. From Metallica to Iron Maiden, to Nirvana, to Soundgarden to Anthrax, literally every hard rock, metal, and alternative rock band has a debt to this album. Paranoid provided misfits and outcasts with identity and belonging. It told them they weren't alone in their darkness. The album also proved something crucial. Authentic art from authentic experience resonates. The music reflected Birmingham's industrial background, and the band's working-class origins permeated every aspect of their sound. They didn't pretend to be something they weren't. They were factory workers who picked up instruments and channeled their environment, their frustrations, their fears into music. And that authenticity became their power. The Satanism accusations continued to haunt Black Sabbath throughout the early 1970s. Paranoid drew controversy for apparently encouraging suicide. The lyric, "I tell you to enjoy life," was frequently misheard as, "I tell you to end your life." Religious groups attacked them. Moral crusaders called for boycotts. Some venues refused to book them. Geezer Butler, who wrote most lyrics, believed fiercely in the power of something he called the devil. He understood many problems he saw, especially war and inequality, as the devil's work. But he clarified that Satan in their songs wasn't a spiritual thing. It was warmongers, people running banks and trying to get the working class to fight wars for them. The band found themselves in an impossible position. Their imagery and themes attracted fans who genuinely believed they were Satanists. Meanwhile, religious critics attacked them for corrupting youth. In a 1982 interview, Butler said that if the moral majority didn't understand something, they'd try to put it down or get people to read things into it. Most of Paranoid was about stopping wars, with some science fiction. There wasn't that much satanic content, and what existed wasn't pro-devil, it was just bringing attention to these themes. But nuance got lost. The album's darkness, intentional commentary on real evil in the world, was interpreted as celebration of evil. This misunderstanding would follow Black Sabbath for decades, even as their influence on metal became undeniable. Even as critics reassessed their work, the Satanism narrative persisted. Ozzy Osbourne later pursued a solo career that played up the Prince of Darkness persona, partly embracing what had been thrust upon them, partly satirizing it. But for the band in 1970-1971, the controversy was frustrating and sometimes frightening. They were working-class kids who'd grown up Catholic, wearing crosses, writing songs about the horrors of war and societal collapse. They'd never expected to become symbols of evil itself. September 18, 1970 to today. More than 50 years have passed since Paranoid was released. The album spent 70 weeks on the US charts. It went gold, then platinum, then multi-platinum. It was Black Sabbath's only album to top the UK albums chart until the release of 13 in 2013. More importantly, it created a template. Heavy metal as a genre didn't exist before Black Sabbath. Blues rock was heavy. Psychedelic rock could be dark. But the combination of elements that Sabbath forged on Paranoid, the crushing riffs, the dark lyrics, the apocalyptic themes, the sheer heaviness, became the foundation of an entirely new form of music. Every subgenre of metal traces back to this album. Doom metal, thrash metal, death metal, black metal, speed metal, progressive metal, all built on the blueprint Black Sabbath established. Master of Reality, with its down-tuned tracks, would go on to inspire new subgenres like sludge metal, doom metal, and stoner rock. Without it, there might not have been Queens of the Stone Age, Sleep, Melvins, or Soundgarden's early sound. But Paranoid was where it started. This was the album that proved heavy could be beautiful, that darkness could be profound, that working-class rage could be art. In 2019, Birmingham honored Black Sabbath by naming a bridge after the group and installing a bench made of heavy metal. The city credits musical pioneers like Black Sabbath with raising Birmingham's cultural profile. In July 2025, Black Sabbath performed their final concert, Back to the Beginning, at Villa Park in Aston, near where the band formed. Ozzy Osbourne, who could no longer walk due to Parkinson's disease, sang while seated. 17 days later, Osbourne passed away at age 76. The performance closed a chapter in rock history that began 55 years earlier in those same Birmingham streets. What can we learn from Paranoid? First, limitations can become strengths. Tony Iommi's finger injury forced him to develop a unique approach that defined a genre. What seemed like the end of his career became the beginning of his legacy. Second, authenticity matters. Black Sabbath didn't manufacture an image. They channeled their real environment, their real frustrations, their real darkness. That honesty resonated across generations. Third, art can speak for the voiceless. Working-class kids from bombed-out Birmingham had something to say about war, alienation, and societal collapse. They said it louder and heavier than anyone before them. Millions of outsiders found their voice in Black Sabbath's music. Fourth, you don't need time or money to make something that lasts forever. 6 days, a modest budget, 4 musicians who understood each other instinctively. That was enough to create one of the most influential albums in rock history. Paranoid proved that heavy could be meaningful, that darkness could illuminate truth, that 4 working-class musicians could change the world. 50 years later, that thunderous sound from Birmingham still echoes. Every time a distorted guitar unleashes a crushing riff, every time a band explores darkness and heaviness, every time an outsider finds belonging in heavy music, Black Sabbath's legacy lives on. They didn't just make an album, they invented heavy metal, and it all happened in 6 days.